All right, I want to welcome everybody and on behalf of Anne Marie and the HSH for our final meeting of the season. And I am proud to make my introduction tonight of our speaker. And here's a little bit about her, that she was born in Harrisburg, went to school in Philadelphia at the Moore College of Art. And she has transformed that into becoming the largest and the only female general contractor in Philadelphia now, with multiple corporations that employ 150 people. So we were really fortunate when she decided to make her home in Pleasant Mills. And with that came an adventure that she will describe to us tonight. So it's a great pleasure that I introduce you to Emily Bittenbender.
Hey guys. So hi, my name is Emily, and I'm really pleased to be here with you guys tonight to talk about the history of Pleasant Mills and actually the mill itself. Just a little bit of background as to how I actually came to live here and fall in love with the Pine Barrens and the history. In the 90s, when I was a lot younger and a little more adventurous, I was obsessed with riding motorcycles, and I had this really slick Harley, and I used to come down and basically tour all over the area. And I would stop at places like Batstow and buy up every history book I could possibly find, and I would zip it up in my motorcycle jacket and shove it in my saddlebags, and just really became incredibly enamored with the area. I think a lot of people drive by and say, you know, what is this amazing little quiet hamlet of Pleasant Mills? And, you know, this is a gorgeous building, obviously has a lot of charm. And some people ask, you know, why or what was it? And some people just drive by. For me, that was something that I couldn't do. I couldn't just drive by and not know. So my heart for the Pine Barrens really got captured by having lunch one day at the Forks restaurant. And I went out on the banks of the river and really looked at the confluence of the Batstow and the Molica coming together, and I felt like my heart was captured, and that something crept in my soul, and that one day I knew that I actually really had to live here, and I wanted to make a lot of money so that I could buy a house on the river. So thank God that happened. I think a lot of people really don't understand the importance that this area played in the American Revolution. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight alongside the history of the mill, and maybe spur some interest because, you know, the people that actually lived there during the Revolutionary War were very interesting characters. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. So anyhow, the first guy is probably one of the biggest power brokers in the Pine Barrens, next to the Richards and the Reeds, who developed Batstow. His name is Elijah Clark, and he built the mansion across from the mill. And at the very young age of 27, actually bought 2 different parcels of property. And he was the first person to build a mill on this exact spot. There was a gentleman by the name of Samuel Cripps that built an earlier mill in 1737, kind of behind the church, where the church is. But Elijah, he has a lot of appeal for me because, first of all, I'm single, and if he was alive today, I would be all over this guy because he was so interesting. But he was a guy that was a gentleman and a pirate. So he was an Englishman that came to the Americas early. He was educated in Harvard. He was very religious and very pious, and he built one of the most sophisticated Georgian mansions in the English style, which is pretty unusual for the other types of kind of Kirk style, log cabin style, very raw style homes that people lived in during that day. But so he was all of these wonderful and glorious things, but at the same time he was a patriot and he was a pirate. And this man really benefited and built a huge fortune from the trade of privateering. But in order for him to make his money to invest in the privateering, he started first with the sawmill. I believe that he built the sawmill prior to the house because I believe that he actually hewn the logs and built the house out of his own sawmill, but that's just my guesstimation. So he was also a lieutenant colonel in the Revolutionary War, And his best friend was a guy by the name of Richard Westcott that lived down the river at the Forks and had a tavern. We'll talk a little bit more about him later. Westcott? Really? If you have any history, please share it.
I went there through the house. Yeah, that's where I fell down across the street in the water.
Oh, did you?
Pictures of the, oh, did you? But yeah, I went there when they had the open house.
Yeah, Sue actually had the open house over here. I was there. I was there too. I'm obsessed with Richard Westcott.
I told you, about 10 of us tomorrow.
Oh, I saw you there. That's right. Yeah. I didn't see you rolling down the hill, but I did see your whole family was in the back in the gazebo sitting by the lake. Yeah. Yeah, I remember you guys. So we should talk offline. I'm obsessed with this guy. He's so cool. He actually left the Pine Barrens, he bought this plantation from Elijah Clark in 1779, sold it in, like, I guess the 1790s, and then moved to Mays Landing. Yeah. So anyhow, this is the property that I bought, and it's actually adjacent to the mill. And the thing that's interesting about this, it's often referred to as the Peninsula property, but it sits in between two colonial spillways. So here's the timeline of the property uses. So there was basically a sawmill from 1737 to 1780. And then Benjamin Richards and a few of his gang actually bought the property much later and turned it into a cotton mill. There was a big hurricane and the cotton mill basically burned down during the hurricane, but it produced, it had like 3,000 spindles in it. And then later, the Richards family basically owned this property for over 100 years in all kinds of iterations, and they were the people that actually bought Batstow too. So big time entrepreneurs, invested a lot of money. Every time they invested in this property and built something significant, it burned down. So it was basically destroyed again in 1787, and then the current rendition of the mill was actually built in 1880, and was in operation to 1915, and then sold again. And then lastly closed in 1925, and I have a bunch of pictures that my friend Amy Howell gave me, I'm gonna show you a little bit later, and kind of sat vacant. Right before the World War II, there was a development company that wanted to come into Pleasant Mills and turn it into a vacation spot, very similar to the Medford Lakes community, but the war hit and money dried up and there was no money for development. So then later on, Bill's going to talk about the history of the Playhouse, which actually opened in 1952. So Lake Nesquecheck is probably the most important part of this mill because it provided the water power for the mill for over 188 years. It was originally the summer camp for the Lenni Lenape Indians. It was settled by the Scots in 1707. And the first sawmill, as I said, was built in the 1730s. But this was once a creek that was dammed up by Elijah Clark. So this basically just shows you where the Batstow, the Mullica, and the Nesquecheck Creek came in. And of course, it's the feeder creeks that go into the wider side of the Mullica and eventually out to the Great Bay. So the road that goes by the mill is actually on top of the original dam. So he dammed up the creek to create spillways. This is the old road heading towards the mill. So you can see the old water tower and the other tower. And this is basically, what I did is I took a picture of a typical type of sawmill from the colonial days to show you what the sawmill would have looked like in that spillway. So they built the mills underneath the power source at a lower elevation so that water would come through the sluiceway and turn the water wheel. So this is a pretty good depiction of a typical water-powered mill system. Let me go back. There's something important I forgot to tell you. So when Elijah Clark went to actually sell this mansion in 1779, there's a description of the property calling it a plantation and had lots of different buildings listed on it, including the sawmill and a grist mill. But one of the things that's very interesting about the history of this mill is that there was a description basically saying that scows carrying 7,000 or 8,000 feet of board go loaded from the mill. And what he did and how he made his fortune is the boards would go down the spillway and dead end at the Mullica, and then go down to either the Forks or Chestnut Neck to deeper water and get loaded on. And the history books basically say that a lot of the lumber from Elijah Clark's sawmill helped to build colonial New York City. And a lot of the interiors, woodworking, fireplaces, mantles, staircases, all came from the Pine Barrens and were actually shipped directly from this site out to the big river and then up to New York.
I have a question. With all these sawmills, because Batsto has one too, and the charcoal industry, it seems to me like they were denuding the pine needles.
Oh, well, okay, here's the thing that I find so fascinating when I think about bringing the whole picture back to life. There were no trees at all. There are people like Benjamin Franklin that traveled down to this area in the late 1700s that said there wasn't a tree in sight, that the whole land was completely barren. The amount of trees it took to burn Batsto and to burn the charcoal pits, I forget the number, but is it like 100 acres a year? Do you remember these numbers? There's some huge amount of numbers. But yeah, and the other thing to remember too is the population. Nobody lives here anymore. It's very quiet, but there used to be 3,000 people that lived between Batsto and Pleasant Mills. So it was a really thriving.
You had the Forks as well.
Well, and the Forks, it's interesting about the Forks. I don't know if any of you read Barbara's book on the history of the Forks. But you go there now and there's like nothing but trees and water. But during this time period, guys, it was lined with wharves and docks, and the Van Sant family shipyard was there, shipbuilding, turpentine, pitch. Like, it was so much entrepreneurship happening in the Pines. And one of the main reasons is because they were flying under the radar of the British, government and the occupation of Philadelphia. There was this thing called the Navigation Acts that made it illegal for the colonials to actually manufacture goods and products, because the British wanted to have a monopoly on the colonials actually buying all their stuff at a greatly reduced rate. So in the Pines, you get all these colonial entrepreneurs that say, forget them, I'm going to the Pines, I'm going to build my own businesses, and under the radar. And that's what actually happened. Glass manufacturing, Batsto created all the ammunitions for the Revolutionary War. There was so much manufacturing going on down here, but the British didn't show up to tax them. So anyhow, and then not to bore everybody, but I just think this is like really hot stuff. Like at low tide, underneath the waterfall, we still have these old pilings, and I fantasize that this is the location of Elijah Clark's colonial gristmill. This is what I do when I'm bored. I go out and look for old pilings. And then here's the other bridge, and this is a guy by the name of Nelson Super. Does anybody know Nelson Super? So Amy Howell over here gave me all these pictures from Nelson from when he actually lived in her house. So you're going to see his family pop up again, which I think is so cool, because isn't that such a different view of Pleasant Mills Road than it is today? Can you just imagine, like, going back in time? Pretty neat. There's Nelson. And again, not to bore you about this, but the other interesting thing about the location of the Forks and Batsto and the Pleasant Mills Mill is it's in the part of the river that's really, really narrow. And the river gets wider when you get down to the Forks, and then obviously Green Bank, Lower Bank, it's exceptionally wide. But it was very strategically placed so that the British and enemies couldn't get up there. So when the British got to Chestnut Neck, they had to have somebody that actually understood the canals and the creeks, like our Captain Sue over here, who takes us out. Isn't it treacherous trying to figure out the navigation? So basically, I'm going to talk a little about privateering later, but just keep in mind that the British could actually never get up. They wanted to kill off Batsto to get rid of all the ammunitions, and they were never actually able to make it up that far. So, privateering. I talked a little bit about the Navigation Acts. The Exchequer was empty, the British were poor, so they thought, we're going to rip off the colonists. Great way to do this, right? By charging them high prices and making it illegal to manufacture goods. So what the Continental Congress did was they issued letters of marque. So letters of marque was kind of like, I'm a contractor and I need a license today to be a contractor. Well, pirates back in those days needed a license to be a pirate, and they were actually issued by the government. So shipbuilding was a huge industry along the Mullica, Batstow, Wading River. So these guys, wealthy people like Elijah Clark, would commission people to build ships and then pay an interest for them to go off out into the Mullica, up to the sea, and they would knock off the British supply chains. So British ships carrying not only products to sell to the colonists, but also their own supplies, which is pretty interesting. So if any of you guys watch Black Sails on TV? Anybody see that? It's a show on pirates from 1705 in the Bahamas. If you haven't seen it, you gotta check it out. It's amazing. And it's very similar to what was actually happening in the Pines during that time. You know, the British called them like a nest of rebels. But they literally helped dismantle, the supply chain, and that's why our areas played such an important role in the Revolutionary War. So, I told you that the riverbanks were lined with wharves and businesses and docks. It was also lined with colonial warehouses that were actually used to store the stolen goods before it went up to auction. And your relative, Richard Westcott, owned the most popular of the auction houses at the Forks. But this is Sue Dunphy's property on the river, and it's the only remaining colonial warehouse left that was used to store stolen goods from the pirates. So this is located in Greenbank. It's an absolutely spectacular property. I'm sure a lot of you guys know this property. So then we get into the era of the paper, and as I said, there was just so many iterations of businesses and deals that went bad, and people died, and states got tied up. But one of the guys that was like kind of the longest surviving operator of the paper mill was this guy named William Farrell, who was originally in business with the Richards family. But if you drive by the cemetery at Pleasant Mills, his obelisk is front and center. He basically survived 2 different mills. He, thank God, had insurance when the first mill burnt down, so he had the capital, about $100,000 to rebuild. These are lithographs that were actually produced by the insurance company to put in place to insure against the next fires. They know exactly what was intact. And there's a list that's been published about all the machinery and everything that was put and paid for in this mill. And then this is basically the plan deal. The other thing is because of the new technology that came out because of the Industrial Revolution, machinery was getting more sophisticated during that time period. So they were able to produce 4,000 pounds of paper in the new mill versus 1,000 pounds with the old technology. So now I'm just going to show you a series of pictures that Amy gave me. The mill closed in 1925, so I think some of these shots were taken probably to create advertisement to try to sell the mill again. But as we all know, the crash came in 1929, so the popularity or the ability for people to come up with capital investment to buy this, was probably not happening at that time period. Let's go back. So my opening picture basically highlights this front building. Some of these other buildings still remain, but a lot of these other structures have now collapsed. The mill has been for sale for the last couple of years and is in foreclosure. I think somebody put an offer, right, Sue, of $50,000 for the mill? Yeah. So we're not quite sure what's going to happen to the mill and the next evolution and whether that sale will actually go through or not. But there have been people that have been interested in buying and demolishing it.
It's not protected anyway?
It's not protected, no. There was, somebody locally, I think, actually applied to put it on the endangered buildings list, but I don't think it was accepted.
Wow.
Isn't that awful?
That's really a shame.
Yeah. So these are shots of the mill taken from my property, which are pretty cool. Have you ever seen these, Nicole? No. No, they're cool, aren't they? The mill pond in the back. And then this is a great picture taken from the water tower. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Lake Nesquachek or not, but there were a number of buildings, apparently like an old colonial tavern called the Sailor Boy. which is no longer there. But again, just shows you how sparse things were compared to how they are today. And then this is the shot taken overlooking the schoolhouse that was basically built for the children that actually lived and the families that worked in the mill. Our friend Linda Watt recently sold this house. She lived in there for years, but the schoolhouse was converted into a residential property. And then this house is actually owned by Amy Howe. Over here, it's for sale too, if anybody wants to be our neighbor. We're a lot of fun out there in Pleasant Mills. Looks a lot different. Sorry, Amy, I should have brought the before picture. But anyhow, this house was built in 1821 by Benjamin Richards when they were actually constructed the cotton mill. And there was a whole series of them, Amy. Like, how many of them were down the road? A bunch of them.
5 on the property.
So there were 5 workers, and they're dual houses. They're 2 families per house, so 10 families could have.
On 3 acres, yeah.
And then they were all burned down. I guess Amy, your house, and then Sally's house is the only one remaining, right? Because lightning strikes, yes it does, especially the Pine Barrens. And this is the super family, I'm assuming. Yep.
Nelson's on the far right.
So that's Nelson. Okay. And then the church itself has a long history. The first church was built here like about 1708 by the Scots. And Elijah Clark had his own version of the church. And then the Richards actually conveyed the deed to the community. And this church was built in 1808 and still stands, still there, and still pretty much looks the same. And then I thought this was interesting. I was showing this to my stepson before I came today. I said, Ryan, like back in the days, like you didn't get a ShopRite in Hamilton. There was a general store at Batstow, and I guess that's where people shop. So here's the George Adams store at Batstow. And then this is the road leading from Sweetwater actually going over to Batstow, so the current day 542. And then I gave a little tribute to Mary. So the pictures that weren't part of the marketing piece that were included of the supers were actually, and she's a Westcote. She was married to David Jr., and she's actually buried in the Pleasant Mills Cemetery. So if you,
Yeah, I've got all the pictures.
oh, so you have all these pictures too? I was going to say.
No, not all those, but I mean the tombstones, but look at the cemetery.
Well, if you want these pictures, you can have them too. I just wanted to give her a little shout out, even though she's dead. I just think it's really neat that her work still survives, and we appreciate, what she did, and just having a sense of like our community and what it looked like. It's important. It makes her very immortal to me. So I'm a fan of Mary's. All right, so that concludes my little portion of the history of the mill, and Bill's going to talk to you about the Playhouse.
Welcome back to Emily and questions and answers after my little talk. Okay, so I'm going to take you from 1952 to 1957 about the Mill Playhouse. So, unfortunately, that I was a teenager then, and my mother and father were regular attendees of the Playhouse. But guys that are 15, they play baseball. They don't go to the theater. So I missed it. But I know that so many of my contemporaries that were there, probably Angela and Janet, Pat Caruso, my friend Lola Burdick. Surprising how many people said, "Oh yeah, I was there." And so I have to live it now through the pictures and the words. So in 1952,
By the way, while he's finding his papers, that's what it looks like today. These are pictures that I took when we all went through it like 2 years ago. All the costumes and all the seating, everything's still there and intact. Wow. Isn't that neat?
so after 25 years or so of silence at the mill, in 1952 that the Hamilton Junior High musical, including Chris Raymond, and he tells me my brother David, were members of a chorale that brought music to the mill. And then in July 3rd,